This is part 2 of a 3-video series on using direct questions, indirect questions, and implicit questions in your academic writing. I'm assuming you have already watched the video on direct questions, or you're already just very familiar with using and forming direct questions from years of learning English. But in some academic writing, indirect questions are preferred. So if you're already familiar with direct questions, let's move on and talk about indirect ones. So, which do you use, direct or indirect? Well, in some journals or fields of study, direct questions are considered too informal for published papers. And so as a result, they may prefer indirect questions. How do you know if they prefer indirect or direct questions? Well, look in a paper published in a journal you are interested in and try searching for a question mark. Direct questions are introduced with or end with a question mark. So if there are no question marks in the whole paper, it may be that it's using indirect questions. You can't just conclude that there is no question, because if it's a paper, if it's a published academic paper, there has to be a question. Otherwise, why publish it? Okay, so we're going to start with content questions instead of yes/no questions. It'll be a little easier to present this way. So let's start off with this example from earlier. Alluvial diamond deposits can be analyzed as systematically as any other geological phenomenon. The rules are that, it will start off with the WH word or phrase. There is no subject auxiliary inversion, no question mark at the end, and it's part of a larger sentence. The larger sentence we're going to use is, the aim of this study is to determine, which is a typical beginning of a sentence you might find in an academic research paper introduction, where they're explaining the purpose of the paper. All right, so now for our WH word or phrase, we'll turn this into how. No inversion, so here's our subject, here's our auxiliary, and here's the rest of the verb phrase, and indeed the rest of the sentence. How alluvial diamond deposits can be analyzed. Okay, let's try another one. Bacteria counts differ under transient and steady state conditions using the direct count microscopic method. All right, so larger sentence, the aim of this study is to determine. This is talking about the circumstances, when something happens, so we'll make that when. Subject comes right down. Auxiliary, no inversion, and in fact there's no auxiliary verb at all here. If this were a direct question, we would have to supply our own auxiliary, do, but because it's indirect, don't do that. The only reason you would put a do is in order to do the inversion, but there is no inversion here, so you just bring the entire rest of the sentence down unchanged. Okay, now let's try one where the WH word or phrase at the beginning is the subject. So this policy should be implemented. Let's ask which policy. So the aim of this study is to determine. This policy becomes which policy. Should comes right down, and so does the rest of the sentence, and we're done. Okay, let's try one with a form of to be, specifically is. So the optimal engineering design method is XYZ. So let's make it part of a larger sentence. The aim of this study is to determine. Let's put our WH word or phrase at the beginning, so this XYZ will just turn into what. No subject auxiliary inversion, so the subject just comes right down. And then the auxiliary, or in this case the main verb, because forms of be can do that, is. And we're done. Let's try one more with a form of to be. This one has are, so the characteristics of the Animas Basin in Colorado are X, Y, and Z. Larger sentence, the aim of this study is to determine. WH word or phrase, so X, Y, and Z, that'll become what. Subject, bring that down next, the characteristics of the Animas Basin in Colorado. And finally, our auxiliary, or in this case it's the main verb to, are. Now, one more thing to notice about this particular example is that we have a very long subject. The reader has to read, what the characteristics of the Animas Basin in Colorado are. So in this case, when you have a very long subject and a very short verb phrase without much meaning of its own, like this form of to be, one thing you can do in English is you can divide this long noun phrase at a logical place and come up with something like this. So let's clear away the mess here and get rid of all this. What the characteristics are of the Animas Basin in Colorado. We could actually say a lot more about splitting up noun phrases this way. It happens in relative clauses too, but that's another video for another day. There's even a shorter way of shortening these indirect questions with what and are, but that will also come in part 3 of the video with implicit questions. Okay, let's move on to yes-no questions. So the same rules apply. They have to start with a WH word or phrase. There's no inversion, no question mark. They're part of a larger sentence. So, bacteria counts differ under transient and steady state conditions using the direct count microscopic method. So let's put it in a larger sentence. The aim of this study is to determine. And now, well, what are we going to do here? We don't have anything to turn into a WH phrase. Nothing to turn into what, where, when, where, who, why, how. But we still have to have a WH word or phrase. So for yes-no questions, there's a WH word that does that. Whether. It doesn't show anything. It just indicates that this is a question. It's a yes-no question, indirect, as part of a larger sentence. And then our subject, bacteria counts, and then the rest of the sentence, differ under blah, 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 blah. And our last example is another yes-no question. So punishment is an effective tool. Larger sentence. The aim of this study is to determine. In addition to whether, there is one question introducer that is not a WH word. It doesn't start with WH. It doesn't have W or H in it. It's just if, and that counts as an honorary WH word for the purposes of introducing an indirect yes-no question. This is not the conditional if. It's just if saying we want to answer this question. And then the subject comes down, and then the rest of the sentence comes down like so. And we're done. So that concludes the presentation of indirect questions. In part 3 of this video series, we will talk about implicit questions for papers or writing styles that don't even like to use indirect questions.